Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dear friends, I would like to welcome you to our online event 1 year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Social Democratic Perspectives on War and Reconstruction. I would like to welcome you on behalf of FEPS. My name is Uwe Optenhögel. I'm a vice president of FEPS, responsible for the relations to our 43 member organizations all over Europe. I will be the moderator of the afternoon. And to start with, I will give you a very short overview over the agenda. We will have 4 moments in the afternoon. There will be first an introduction by FEPS General Secretary László Andor. After that, we have 3 keynote inputs where I will introduce the speakers later. The third moment will be a roundtable debate among the authors of a book we are going to publish, plus additional experts we invited who are working with FEPS on a foresight project regarding Ukraine and the repercussions of the war. So far, I would like you to know that you can participate in the debate and you should request the floor in the chat. There's no possibility to just raise your hands, which sometimes is the case in webinars. So we ask you to request the floor through the chat, and we will open to the general public after the debate in the roundtable among the experts invited by FEPS. So far for the agenda of the afternoon. And with this, I would immediately go over to László Andor, FEPS General Secretary, and ask you, László, to come in with your introduction, please.
Thank you very much, Uwe. Dear friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me also welcome you on behalf of FEPS. 1 year ago, as you know, the Russian aggression against Ukraine was a shock for Europe. It was not the start of the conflict, but definitely a turning point that brought about immense destruction, loss of lives, and emigration in an unprecedented scale. FEPS, as much as possible, works on the basis of annual planning. However, like all think tanks, and especially those in Brussels, we had to change our plans and devote attention and energy to the war and its potential short-term and long-term consequences. Here you can see a short summary of activities which we carried out in the past year in connection with the war in Ukraine. With this presentation, we would also like to thank everyone who contributed to this cycle. Together with FEPS member foundations, we organized conferences focusing on the war, starting with Vienna in March and ending 2022 with an expert workshop in Warsaw. In May, we hosted a so-called review meeting with Josep Borrell, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, who is at the same time also Vice President of the European Commission. FEPS policy studies and policy briefs published in this period delivered fresh analysis on a number of questions like the opinion of young Europeans on the war, or disinformation on migration from Ukraine, and the consequences on global security. Throughout this long period, the Progressive page online published timely commentary about the war, and a selection of these articles regularly appeared in the printed Progressive Post. If you do not yet subscribe to the Progressive Post newsletter, this is the moment to do so. The Progressive Post, by the way, just yesterday published a dedicated dossier about various aspects of the war, including the role of values in European solidarity with Ukraine, the support provided by European local governments to the reconstruction, and Ukraine's lost generation. FEPS Talks, the podcast series of FEPS, also covered the war in Ukraine regularly, with conversations on specific angles of the conflict, including the question of sanctions, EU integration, and the impact on universities. The latest episode of FEPS Talks on the war was published last week with Bohdan Ferens, founder of the Social Democratic Platform of Ukraine. And those who follow FEPS on Twitter or LinkedIn are always alerted on new episodes of FEPS Talks. Now, the Progressive Yearbook 2023 appeared in January and devoted a large share of content to the war. As at the launch of the yearbook, we welcomed the Polish mayor of Warsaw district, Gerrits as a Progressive Person of the Year for providing effective humanitarian support to Ukrainian refugees. And with the foreign policy expert, Giovanni Grevi, FEPS launched a project on foresight, which will lead to a volume discussing the long-term implications of the war, for example, from the point of view of climate change or international trade. And finally, our visiting fellow André Korniychuk has delivered an important study on the possibilities of progressive policy towards the Eastern neighborhood. What is not yet published, but will be soon in the spring period, a volume of 20 short studies under the title Ukraine and Europe 1 year into the war, edited by Uwe Optenhögel and myself, about various aspects of the war, including the ideology of Vladimir Putin, the transformation of Ukrainian politics and society at the time of the war, the role of Western weapons deliveries and media coverage. The book also covers the global dimensions, like the reactions of the BRICS group and the repercussions on international energy markets and food supply. Despite the diversity of the topics, the chapters present a common, broadly defined progressive orientation, of course, without assuming that all authors would agree with all others regarding every single detail. Overall, the content of the volume would reflect, first of all, the importance of solidarity with Ukraine in military as well as humanitarian aspects, and also regarding the post-war reconstruction. Secondly, the awareness of the social consequences of military and economic warfare inside the European Union and the need to tackle those by strengthening social safety nets. And third, the concerns regarding worldwide implications like food crises and other spillovers, and peace being a common global interest. These three angles, in our view, represent the pillars of social democratic strategy concerning the war and the shape of a new foreign policy in the post-war period. Once published, this reader will be disseminated within the Brussels policymaking bubble, the FEPS membership, and the wider social democratic family in Europe and beyond. We will soon start thinking about promotion outside Brussels in various capitals of Europe and as part of a dedicated roadshow. Ladies and gentlemen, when peace comes, it will offer Ukraine reconstruction as well as transformation. European countries will have to remain united in the reconstruction effort as they have been in the military and the humanitarian support. FEPS will continue working on Ukraine and its relations with the European Union, and I believe our discussions today will provide further inspiration for this work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, László, for this comprehensive introduction, which I think showed well the activities of FEPS, which FEPS is doing together with the member foundations and distinguished experts. László will obviously be with us the whole afternoon, so if you may have questions concerning his introduction, there will be a chance at a later stage. But I think we should now come to the three keynote inputs. I would like to start with Yuliya Yurchenko. Yuliya is a senior lecturer and researcher in political economy at the Political Economy, Governance, Finance and Accountability Institute of the University of Greenwich. I think you're also connected from London, from Greenwich today, Yuliya. Welcome. Yuliya will start, then it will be Stephen Bronner, and last but not least, the third input comes from André Gerrits. We agreed on roughly 15 minutes of input, and then after the inputs, I will give the keynote speakers a chance to have a very brief exchange among them, and then we go over to the roundtable debate with the experts I mentioned in my welcome. All right, Yuliya, are you ready? Would you be ready to start?
Yes, certainly. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I think so.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you for all the work that you've been doing this year and previously. It's invaluable, and it helps the world make sense of this senseless war and its effects, but it also helps those of us who are trying to think about the future shape of policies and institutions in Ukraine to make sense of what those could and should be. I really look forward to this collection of essays coming out, and I have to say that writing this chapter, I was invited to write about economic and social losses that Ukraine has sustained through this war. It has been the hardest thing that I had to write in my whole life. It has been extremely difficult and extremely emotional, and fitting the horror of 9 years of this war, and especially the final year, has been, it's impossible to fit into a single chapter, and even more difficult to fit into 15 minutes of a talk. So I'll give some sense of it, and I invite all of you to take a look at the full chapter, but also at all the work that FEPS were doing and other campaigning organizations and think tanks were doing through this year and before. So when Russia invaded Ukraine for the second time, a year ago, Ukraine was already one of the poorest and most indebted countries in Europe, indeed the most, by some estimates. And of course, its needs and losses have grown exponentially since the invasion started. Its needs and the dislocation of the labor force and infrastructure destruction and ecocidal damage are also impossible to calculate at this point, because a lot of the areas are still occupied. The damage is being sustained on hourly basis. And so the full scope and scale, even at replacement cost of those damages, we will only be able to know once Russia withdraws its troops from Ukraine, once they're chased out. What I try to do in this chapter also is to argue for the large-scale, multifaceted international assistance, for the debt cancellation in Ukraine, and here I mean state debt, but also the household debt, because people have depleted their savings and have maxed out their credit cards, and they shouldn't have to pay for what is not their fault. And I also argue a case for fiscal activism as precondition for building and rebuilding a resilient and sustainable economy in Ukraine, and making it a country that millions are fighting for, so many have died and so many suffer for today. So the economic damages have been exponential, as I've already mentioned, and some of the earlier assessments were more pessimistic than more recent assessments. So in the April of last year, the projected contraction of GDP was set at 45%. They have made more optimistic ones halfway through the year, because of the combination of aid and reassessment of the scale of damages, but also not least the suspension of Ukraine's federal debt payments, affecting some 70% of debt. But of course, those improved, so to speak, numbers should not lure us into a false sense of optimism. At this point, a lot of money will be needed, and still now is needed and will be needed, to reconstruct Ukraine's homes and infrastructure, clean up, demine, and decontaminate cities and countryside, and of course take care of those who are physically and mentally traumatized through this process. At this point, some 20% of Ukraine is still occupied. The country is losing its infrastructure, industrial and agricultural capacity, imports and exports are disrupted, and industries are leaking cadre due to displacement and refugee flows. There are impairments, physical and mental, that are being done to people's minds and bodies, and of course, death. And some regions have been more affected than the rest, of course. The main culprit of this war, the Russian Federation, will have to pay for the ruination that they caused, and proposals and actions are being discussed. Many of those, some of those are underway, some of them are still being discussed, and indeed a lot of Russian assets are being frozen, but it's going to be a long time still till we see them actually seized and forwarded to Ukraine. And for that, there will be a need to set up repossessing and reparation mechanisms that would be more advanced, and that will most likely happen only after Ukraine's victory. So now, in the remaining 10 minutes or so, I want to focus on the losses that Ukraine sustained to date against the backdrop of the constraints and opportunities before Ukraine's governing institutions, potential and challenges for recovery set out in the post-war reconstruction plan in Lugano, and how we can help it be delivered. So I already mentioned that the accurate economic losses are impossible to calculate, not least because a lot of territory is still being occupied, and the damage is being done as we speak. There is ongoing shelling. But by the end of 2022, the total documented damage to infrastructure was estimated at $137.8 billion at replacement cost. Those numbers are being collected under the EGI of Kyiv School of Economics with a number of different ministries and think tanks, and they acknowledge very clearly that that number is severely underestimated, but they only document what there is data for so far. There is also additional, of course, ecocidal damage that is being done in Ukraine, and that is even more palpable because Ukraine is home to 35% of Europe's biodiversity, including 70,000 species of plants and animals, many of which are rare, relict, and endemic. And that is something that, of course, some of it will be impossible to calculate in terms of damages. Some of it will be impossible to recover. The Ministry for Ecology and Natural Resources has estimated $46 billion damages to direct war damages to air, forest, soil, and water, remnants and pollution from use of weapons and military equipment, and contamination from the shelling of thousands of facilities holding toxic and hazardous materials. And those estimates are purely the emissions and contamination damages of those invaluable species, as I mentioned, will be impossible to calculate. The most scary, the most irreplaceable damages, of course, are also the damages to human life, because beyond the body count, we cannot really have any grasp on the scale of that. And I want here to also stress and remind that this war is 9 years old. It didn't start, it escalated into this most full-on scale a year ago, but it started with the annexation of Crimea in March 2014, and since then, UN has estimated that the total number of conflict-related casualties of Ukraine from 2014 to the end of 2021 was between 51 and 54,000 people, and that included civilians and the military. From last February to 12th of February 23, the UN Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights recorded 18,955 civilian casualties in the country, of which 7,199 were killed and 11,756 were injured. That includes a lot of children as well, and there are many bodies whose sex is still not identified. The full scope and scale, of course, is significantly higher. There are, we will only know with time the full scope of that. That's the care for the traumatized and displaced population, for their medical needs and recovery of those wounded, will require increasing cash and medication flows, of course. And a lot of it comes as donations at home and abroad, including free psychological helplines and resources. But of course, Ukraine will need significantly more money and more sustainable sources of financing than donations, because those peter out, as we already see. People get tired of this war abroad, that is, but also run out of the resources to donate as the number of international catastrophes are increasing. So in 22, for example, in the year 2022, UNOCHA reported that of 40.3 billion emergency humanitarian funding needed and pledged by various countries, only 80% of that has actually hit Ukrainian accounts. So even the country level assistance that was required was not fully gathered. And so Ukraine really, an international plan needs to be put in place for more sustainable financing of recovery of these damages. And again, waiting for Russia to pay for it may take quite some time. It is hard to be precise about the social losses and damages as well. Not unlike, and that is for the reasons that are not unlike to those why we don't know the full scope of economic losses, but also quite different ones too. Again, I want to stress that this war is 9 years old, and pre-2020 invasion, Ukraine's refugees and displaced people, overwhelmingly from Donbass, many went to Russia. 1.7 million indeed were IDPs inside Ukraine as well by the end of 2021. And the invasion, the current invasion, has led to 7.7 million internally displaced persons by mid-spring already, and that number keeps changing. Some people go back to their homes where areas have been liberated. Some have become refugees, some have stayed with families, and so we do not have full accurate numbers. In terms of refugee numbers, over 8 million of those are recorded in Europe by the 7th of February of this year, of which nearly 5 registered for temporary protection and on similar national schemes across Europe. And in addition, almost 3 million went to Belarus and Russia. And of course, we cannot be fully certain of those numbers as to how accurate they are. In the displacement, a lot of capitalist and patriarchal reproductive inequalities have been exacerbated. So refugees and internal displaced persons alike have felt kind of enforced care put overwhelmingly on women because of how refugee flows were managed. The men of conscription age and women of certain professions that were crucial for military effort were not allowed to leave the country. And that meant to a very strongly gendered aspect of refugee flows. In addition to that, according to the Ombudsman Office, some hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children were forcibly taken to Russia, while accurate information about them, their location and names and their numbers are unknown. So far, only the identity of 13,000 of those children is established. There are numerous problems that IDPs and refugees are facing that I cannot go into all of them at this moment, but just some to mention is that those who ended up in Russia, if they're LGBTQI persons, they face discrimination and lack of access to care that they may need, and women who have ended up in Poland struggle to have access to abortion, and in some cases, those women have suffered rape by Russian military. Many women and children have ended up in sex trafficking, and we will simply not know their full numbers, especially if they ended up in countries where prostitution has been legalized. The situation in Ukraine, back in Ukraine, the situation with employment, wages and income is completely atrocious. The wages have been shrinking, the inflation has been going, access to certain goods and services has been significantly disrupted, and that is all amongst the 26.6% of year-on-year inflation and especially access to certain types of medication is really compromised. I'm going to stop at the social losses here and kind of come back to the reconstruction plan and to the economic needs. So I've already mentioned, like, one of the positive aspects of assistance to Ukraine has been the suspension
just to indicate to you, you have another 4 or 5 minutes just to orient
you. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Yes. So there's been suspension of Ukraine's foreign debt. It's not a cancellation, it's suspension, and I do make a case that that debt needs to be written off, not unlike of other countries that find themselves in similar situations. But in addition to that, Ukraine, because foreign debts come with a lot of conditionality, especially the debt with IMF, Ukraine's autonomous decision-making in economic, social, and environmental policies cannot be guaranteed if debt repayment conditionalities that not least require strict budgetary controls and limit states' capacity to intervene in social policy. Those conditionalities need to go, and that needs to go as well. In the summer of 2022, in Lugano, in July, Ukraine, together with international partners, have unveiled the recovery plan for Ukraine in Lugano that has a lot of excellent principles embedded in it, including sustainability, multi-stakeholder engagement, gender equality and inclusion, transparency and accountability and rule of law, partnership and reform focus. And those sound great, and the cost of that recovery plan has been estimated at $750 billion so far at the very least, and that includes the liquidation phase, short-term and long-term recovery for the economy. But the thing is that a lot of these excellent aims that are embedded in the plan, as I document in my chapter, they also sit against the means that I hope will not be able to deliver that kind of plan, because there is a lot of talk about deregulation, shrinking of the state, and the role of private sector in the economy. But the thing is that in the war-torn economy, and the war isn't over yet, and it won't be probably for some time, as sad as it is for me to acknowledge. Private investors private investment does not carry out the military effort, especially private investment from abroad. Ukraine will need an active role of the state in its economy. It needs fiscal activism. This is state intervention into stabilization of business cycles, rather than austerity amidst wartime. This is what Ukraine will need. For that, of course, Ukraine will need grants and multifaceted economic assistance with recipient input and ownership of the reforms that will be put in place, but also with an active role of the state. And I think, like, the negative role or the negative image of the state as an institution and economic activity that is being sacrosanct in a sense, like in the neoclassical economic thinking and neoliberal policies, that needs to go. The state actually is very useful and very needed, especially in wartime economy. We know that from the experience of the Second World War, but also most recently pandemic management. We know that during fundamental crisis in our economies, it is the state that carries out where markets fail. And in Ukraine, indeed, where both states and markets have been failing, civil society organizations and trade unions stepped in, and they have carried out a lot of the sourcing of medical needs, a lot of the sourcing of non-military needs of the army, from food to medication, helping internally displaced persons, housing, everything else. Those organizations need to be integrated into a polycentrically formed state as an apparatus to actually help remedy the economy. On top of that, of course, there is a strong need to create green and low carbon jobs in care economy, arts, education, environmental preservation, and sustainable research and development. There needs to be just transition and energy democracy that will maximize possibilities for Ukraine's economic self-sufficiency and reduce import dependency of key industries. That is something that will need to be financed by the state and owned by the people who are investing their effort, time, and essentially money by proxy of the state into the rebuilding of the economy. All of those millions of people who have lost their homes, who have lost their jobs, who are now displaced across Ukraine, but also in Europe and elsewhere, they will need somewhere to come back to. Without a program of social housing, that currently is non-existent in Ukraine, without a program of organized job creation, without proper financing of public services, kindergarten, school, healthcare, that people simply will not come back. There will be no one to rebuild Ukraine. We have learned the developmental state from the experience of the Second World War is what rebuilds economies most destroy. We need that for Ukraine. We need to learn that, and we need to wedge that strongly in this recovery plan. Without that active role of the state, albeit in a shape that is polycentric, where civil society organizations and trade unions are playing a key role and who are scaffolded and propped up financially by the state, we will not have the recovery that Ukraine needs. It simply will not be possible. And EU membership here and alignment and promise of that, and the alignment of Ukrainian regulations and norms with those of the EU, with the lessons that EU has learned through COVID recovery, but also remedying the effects of austerity, having proper stakeholder dialogue, having proper environmental protection, rights of workers who Ukrainian government has thrown to the docks in the summer of this year, affecting 70% of labor force. All of those need to be put in place. And we have heard alarms about that from the International Labour Organization, for example. So people who are fighting and dying for Ukraine, they need to be allowed to build the Ukraine that they are fighting for. And for that, Ukraine will need help and it will need money, but also more importantly, be allowed to exercise decision-making on its own terms. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yuliya. That was not only a picture from the inside, certainly very emotional for you when you collected all the data and had a look into all these different areas where the repercussions of the war are dramatic. But I also shall thank you very much for risking already a look ahead into the reconstruction and eventual reconstruction, and making clear that this cannot follow what we have experienced in the transitions in Central and Eastern Europe and only be a neoliberal approach left to the market, but that it needs a strong, proactive state that draws also on civil society, which has proven in Ukraine to be a decisive factor, that it can be a decisive factor. So thank you very much for this first input. We come back to you in the debate. But now we go over to the second input, which is a totally different perspective. I would like to ask Professor Stephen Bronner to talk about the global politics of war and peace. Stephen is Board of Governors Professor of Political Science at Rutgers University, and he is Director of Global Relations for the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights, an intimate, knowledgeable American scholar of Europe, who knows Europe well, has roots in Europe. So, Stephen, we welcome you warmly and ask you to come in with your perspective. Stephen is connecting from Fort Lee in New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Uwe, and thank you very much also, Yuliya, for your informative talk. I learned a good deal. And so, and let me also thank thank FEPS for the invitation. I was greatly honored. I only wish it was under better circumstances. You all know the Russian-Ukrainian war has resulted in a year of death. And the number of dead and wounded is contested, but this much is clear. Russia did not foresee the costs, and Ukraine is the victim of genocide mired in rubble, drained by refugees, and it has lost close to half of its electric grids and power stations. Thousands are suffering now from lack of water, heat, electricity, medicine, and functional hospitals. Also, as Yuliya noted, the environmental devastation is incalculable. So let me say at the start that, in my opinion, terminating aid is unthinkable, but tying it to a peace strategy is not. And the reasons is, if I may say so, speaks to the benefit of Ukraine and its supporters as well. Behind the enthusiastic language of our leaders, it's hard for me to imagine that current levels of aid can continue forever. That's especially true with the United States. It has already spent $113 billion just in 2022, which is twice the amount it wasted in Afghanistan. And 2023 has been already greeted with the promise of another $4.5 billion. Now, that the consensus which appears in Europe is, in my opinion, far shakier than is normally given credit. Left-wing critics are grumbling about funding a proxy war and the profits accrued by the military and industrial complex. Meanwhile, influential extremists in the Republican Party are embracing isolationism and seeking to cut off aid entirely. Others among the extremist wing of the Republican majority in the House of Representatives is in favor of, if you like, withdrawing our support for NATO. Finally, polls indicate that Ukraine is a very low priority in the minds of voters, which is normally the case with foreign policy. Now, what's more, there are new dangers. Aside from the balloon controversy, the US is engaged in a computer chip war and competition over semiconductors with China. The US has also committed to defending Taiwan and South Korea. New aid packages for Indonesia and Philippines are already being prepared, along with increases in military spending for the region. The Pacific has traditionally been of primary importance for the United States. What's more, the old nuclear arms treaty between the United States and Russia has been scrapped. It seems to me China is ready to provide further military aid, which is also the case with Iran. And it's important to consider that Russia appears its only major, or their only major ally in resisting what is seen, for better or worse, as American hegemony. India, South Africa, Armenia, and the Central Asian stands have also helped Russia sidestep restrictions imposed by sanctions and mitigate their impact. Excuse me. As a consequence, Russian trade has to a certain degree bounced back to pre-war levels, at least according to the New York Times. And its GDP is an unexpected 3% rise. In short, predictions about Russian economic collapse are premature. It can continue the war. Now we shift to Europe. Is Europe willing to shoulder more of the burden? Maybe is an inadequate answer. This is where the question of negotiations comes in. Russian President Vladimir Putin has stated his readiness to participate in an international peace conference. His conditions are: Ukraine must first demilitarize, recognize Russian annexations, especially Crimea and territories around Kherson, and guarantee Russian security. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky has stated that he too is ready for peace talks, but if I can say so, he believes that Russia must first meet 10 conditions, including the withdrawal of all forces from all Ukrainian territories, including Crimea. The mutual insincerity of the leaders is appalling. Negotiations are superfluous when the rivals insist on having their respective goals met in advance. Such preconditions are mere excuses to delay talks, and the old justifications have vanished. Fears of appeasement were perhaps legitimate when Russia first launched its invasion. However, since then, President Biden has reinvigorated NATO to defend against aggression. Also, Russian losses have surely taken on Russian losses have also been far greater than anticipated. It seems to me that further imperialist undertakings are off the agenda for the moment. Europe's defense of Ukraine's sovereignty, or NATO's defense of Ukraine's sovereignty, is well-intentioned. Nevertheless, the reality is that Ukraine is completely reliant on foreign aid and military aid. Its sovereignty is also going to remain compromised so long as the war continues. Restoring Ukrainian sovereignty will require something like a new Marshall Plan, with the state as a primary actor. Yuliya is quite right in that. The Marshall Plan was the greatest success of American foreign policy in the last 75 years, which provided, and of course it provided Europeans devastated by World War II with vast infusions of aid. What's crucial, however, and which cements Yuliya's point, is that this aid was administered by the nations themselves to rebuild their infrastructure. Now, the idea that this is some proxy war dictated by American or European imperialist interests is absurd. And the fact of the matter is that American progressives often have a very difficult time analyzing any conflict in which the United States is not the bad guy. But it doesn't always have to be the bad guy. That was certainly the case when Richard Holbrooke brought warring ethnic leaders to the negotiating table in Bosnia, in the Bosnian crisis of the 1990s, and helped prevent further massacres. And I think that is the case here. Whatever my criticisms, I applaud President Biden's leadership in responding to authoritarian aggression, and I believe that under the right circumstances, he will also play an important role in bringing peace to this region of the world. The reality is that the parameters of peace, which we can discuss later, are already in place, and they're unlikely to change. Geopolitical realities do not simply vanish. In this vein, neither Russia nor Ukraine can win the war in the conventional meaning of the term, at least in my opinion. The likelihood is that both sides will lose. Given this, it's perhaps useful to recall the Spanish Civil War. The anti-fascist cause was just. It was supported by all decent people and celebrated by writers like Ernest Hemingway and George Orwell. The fighting was fierce, and in 1939, a peace treaty was signed. However, in reality, the defeat of the anti-fascists was already assured following the disastrous Battle of Barcelona in 1937. Was it just to keep calling for useless sacrifices during those 2 years? Contempt for negotiation efforts by self-styled human rights activists turned prolonging the war into a self-fulfilling prophecy. As they condemn Russian atrocities, they endorse the policies that assure their continuation. Not to talk about peace is to perpetuate war, pure and simple. And so I would say, negotiate now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. for a more geopolitical perspective. Thank you for reminding us that Ukraine, the war, the conflict for the US is but one conflict in the global, on the global scale. And I think it's also more than just that you remind us of Europe itself and its will and its capability to shoulder more burden. This is certainly what we face as a debate in all our European societies. But I believe particularly would like to thank you for drawing some perhaps further leading historical comparisons, because I think that very often can be helpful if we look at history and how conflicts were managed and eventually solved by then. So we also come back to you later, and we may take up the question of the chances for peace talks more towards the end of the meeting. Thank you, Stephen. Now I would like to ask André Gerrits to come in. His topic will be Ukraine, Russia, and Europe in the political philosophy of Vladimir Putin. André is a professor of international studies and global politics at the Institute for History at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And he's a member of the FEPS Scientific Council, works with FEPS for quite some time already. We're happy about that. André, I would like you to come in now with your reflections on Vladimir Putin's political philosophy.
Thank you very much, Uwe, and thank you for having me. And thanks to Yuliya and Stephen for their presentations. Yeah, both of my contribution in the book and also in this short talk, I will elaborate on the political philosophy of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and what it might mean for Ukraine and the Russia-Europe relationship. Well, I was a bit hesitant when you asked me a couple of months ago to write a piece on Putin's political philosophy, because the first thing that came to my mind is who really cares about Putin's political philosophy, and if he has one in the first place. Given the rambling, incoherent, and contradictory nature of his reflections, I would argue that the philosophical, the ideological, and the political significance must be considered rather low. Moreover, we can never be sure if the Russian president is actually driven by his ideas, by the ideas that he presents in public, or that he simply uses them as a sort of arguments to legitimize his political actions. Still, after considering the topic, I thought perhaps we should take his ideas, his publicly expressed ideas, seriously, because they may be incoherent and sometimes even ludicrous and highly cynical. They are largely consistent. They are consistent across time, so to speak. There's a second reason why I think that we should take them seriously, his political philosophy, his political ideas. And that is because if the limited information that we have on the decision-making process in the Kremlin concerning the war in Ukraine, 2014 and 2022, then Putin's personal ideas may be highly relevant, because the little that we know indicates that the decision to invade Ukraine twice was taken in a among a very small group of people, if not by Putin personally. And that also applies, most probably, to what Stephen was talking about, the prospects of peace negotiations. If they do depend to such an extent on one single individual, perhaps in combination with a few of his confidants, then the ideas, the philosophy, if you like, of this individual is of some importance. Now, let me begin by raising the question, which I raised more extensively in my paper, who inspires Putin? There has been a bit of press coverage of that. Who are sources of inspiration? Well, it's a motley crew of people, a very diverse group of people, of mostly conservative, anti-communist, and religiously inspired individuals, both white counter-revolutionaries, so linked to the early phase of the Bolshevik regime in Russia, and Soviet dissidents, of whom the most important person probably was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So the current president of the Russian Federation, the former chief of the KGB, feels particularly inspired by a former dissident of the Soviet Union. It's at least a juicy detail, I would argue. Now, what do these people have in common, these sources of inspiration? Now, what do they share with Putin's worldview? I think there are four major issues which these individuals have in common. First of all, they emphasize the unique nature of Russia, which is defined, this unique nature of Russia, by a combination of history, religion, orthodoxy, political culture, autocracy, and space, Eurasia. They all share these very same elements of Russia's uniqueness, including Putin himself. Secondly, they stress, they emphasize, and again, so does Putin himself, that Russia and the West, including most of Europe, are deeply different civilizations. So they emphasize the unique difference of Russia. Three, they highlight that Western democracy, or Western liberalism actually, or for that matter, Western Marxism, poses a very serious threat to the spiritual unity and the distinctiveness of the Russian civilization. And finally, in the context of the war in Ukraine and the war against Ukraine, probably most importantly, they are all committed to the shared historical mission of the Eurasian peoples, led by Russia, in which context they dismiss the historical or actual independent statehood of Ukraine, something which all of these thinkers have in common, which Putin copied from them. Now, what does this all mean for Putin's current policies towards Ukraine and the future of EU-Russia relations? Well, first about Ukraine. Now, as you're probably aware of, there are two sets of explanations, two clusters of explanations of why Russia invaded Ukraine, 2014 and 8 years later. There's a security policy account, and there is a more historical, cultural, if you like, explanation. Now, the security explanation puts the war in the context of post-Cold War relations between Russia and the West, expansion of NATO, expansion of the European Union, it's all well known. The more culturally inspired explanation, which is equally, if not more important, as far as I'm concerned, puts the war in Ukraine in the context of failed decolonization, to put it in simple terms, including the specifically aggressive and imperialist attitude of the Putin leadership. Now, in the debate among Western observers, the debates on the causes of the war, there is no debate in the Russian Federation, as we all know, because there is no political space for a debate. These two explanations, the security one and the historical cultural one, are generally opposed. It's either one or the other. I think that's wrong. I think that they are causally linked. I do believe that the war in Ukraine is both a strategic conflict with the West and a late colonial act of aggression by the Kremlin. The reason why I do think so is because indeed the essence of the two explanations is identical, and that's Russia's pursuit of hegemony over Ukraine. Absolutely key to how Putin looks at Russia's foreign policies, Russia's identity, and Russia's global status. And the key phrase here, to which I will return in a moment, the key phrase here is Eurasia, or perhaps better, greater Eurasia. Now, I tried to put it in one simple sentence, which in the end, of course, was not really a simple sentence, but still one. That's the following one. Eurasia is a vital element of Russia's great power status, and Ukraine is a vital element of Russia's perception of Eurasia. If you start considering this and considering this seriously, you do understand why Putin argues time and again that hegemony over Ukraine is in the deepest interest of the Russian Federation possible. It's even linked to the survival of the Russian Federation. Because don't forget, for Vladimir Vladimirovich, Russia is a great power or Russia is not. And I mean this literally. It's a great power or it doesn't exist.
Right.
Well, there's an ideological, philosophical, and a more strategic dimension to Putin's Eurasianism. This key phrase in his world outlook, his Weltanschauung, as the Germans say. The former, the ideological dimension, comes very close to what we tend to call the civilizational state. That's Putin's understanding of Russia. It's a political entity that combines the attributes of a state and a civilization. That's one. The second dimension, the more strategic dimension of Putin's perception of Eurasia, is slightly different. His most important strategic consideration is that Eurasia is a powerful and largely self-sufficient territorial and political entity, the one and only possible counterweight to expansive Atlanticism. Now, this is where Europe comes in, as far as I'm concerned. The dominant idea in Europe is, I think, that Ukraine is also fighting our war, right? We support Ukraine to stop further Russian aggression, to defend ourselves. The narrative in Russia is totally different. Obviously, it's different. Russia considers itself, I'm still paraphrasing Putin's ideas, Russia considers itself as a civilization under pressure. Putin repeatedly uses the image of a beleaguered Russia. Now, to cope with that siege, to cope with that state of being beleaguered, Putin has opted, as far as I'm concerned, if I read him rightly, has opted for a combination of, on the one hand, expansion, his idea of greater Eurasia, and on the other hand, which may sound a bit counterintuitive, isolation. And that's the idea of fortress or island Russia. Now, this is Putin's two-pronged foreign policy, if you like, which is typically Russian. You can find traces of these two approaches throughout Russian history. Expansion on the one side, and inward lookingness, isolation, if you like, on the other side. Now, before he fell in disfavor, if he actually did, I'm not sure, talking about Vladislav Surkov, one of Putin's most powerful advisors, Putin wrote a piece about 2-3 years ago, before the second invasion of Ukraine, that Russia may face, as he put it, 100 years of strategic solitude, or as he added, perhaps 200 years, or even 300. This is a sharp consequence, I would argue, of this idea of island Russia, fortress Russia. It's a very controversial notion, but it's increasingly en vogue in Moscow. If you read the stuff that is being written by Russia's loyal intellectuals and royal think tanks, but also by politicians and political thinkers, you meet that all the time. The idea that Russia depends on itself, that Russia needs to look inwards, including, of course, the hegemony over Eurasia. And most foreign policy thinkers link to this idea of strategic solitude or isolation, a policy of cultural indifference to the outside world, including a policy of cultural distance, if not indifference, to Europe. So not so much hostility, but distance and non-interference. This is the dominant aspect of geopolitical thinking in Russia with respect to Europe and the European Union. Now, does Putin follow the same strategy, inspired by this idea of we depend on ourselves and the rest of the world, including Europe, is basically irrelevant? Putin follows the same strategy, I guess, be it in an adapted form. He does not tire of emphasizing that protecting Russia's sovereignty and protecting Russia's unique identity are among the main drivers of his foreign policy. And that is exactly why he believes that Russia needs to build this fortress Russia in Eurasia. And like the modern isolationists, if you like, in Russia's political discourse, Putin hardly makes any mention in his public speeches, at least not over the last couple of years, of the European Union.
Mhm.
It's basically absent. It seems as if the European Union has disappeared from Russia's current geopolitical considerations. And I mean it literally disappeared. This will have major consequences, obviously, for our policies towards Russia during the war and after the war, but that is something which I leave to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, André. I personally think it's quite worthwhile to have a look into these things because I think the West for too long has not taken it serious at all. And now we wonder how come in certain moments and regarding certain arguments and also decisions in Europe. So we might be forced to deal more with these ideas in the background of Vladimir Putin. And I think if we look forward to whatever kind of negotiation that might come up, the very fact you stressed in the end of your input that the EU practically totally disappeared from the horizon of Vladimir Putin, I think we have to see to what extent the EU can make an impact on the end of the war and on a possible settlement of the conflict. Okay, so far so good. I would leave it to that. Is there anything among the three speakers you want to comment immediately on regarding another of the keynotes, or shall we go into the round table immediately? But if there would be questions among the three of you, we should do that first.
Well, sure, I have a couple of questions, but as far as I'm concerned, Uwe, we can go over to the a more general debate.
Okay.
Where we then can have our contribution, if you like.
Okay, Yuliya and Stephen, you're also okay with this?
Yes, that's totally
Most
fine.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
László,
Very
what
provocative.
you wanted to comment?
Thank you.
No. Okay, yeah, then, I mean, we already have people who have registered and asked for the word. There is André Korniychuk, who said he would want to comment, and also Ireneusz Bil. I think, André, you were first. Perhaps when you come into the debate, present yourself briefly and welcome with your comment or question.
Yes, hello everyone. I hope the sound quality is fine, but
It's
please
okay.
tell me.
For us, it's
Yes.
good.
Yeah. So I am a non-resident postdoctoral fellow at FEPS. As László mentioned, I have been working specifically on the Eastern dimension of EU policies and hopeful membership of Ukraine in the EU. But perhaps my intervention, a short one, because I imagine there's a lot of commentary going and a lot of feedback that would be useful to hear, is perhaps few things that I think need to be emphasized as long as we are meeting on the sad anniversary of 1 year. So what I would like to emphasize is saying that I think what we hear throughout the last year is a lot of focus on territory. There's not much discussion, or there is discussion, but in my opinion, it flies a bit under the surface, is about the people. So, of course, the territory is crucial, and I do not debate the relevance, or I do not want to start any sort of discussion on a territorial concession or possibility of such. But what I would like to emphasize is the importance of looking also fast forward onto the toll, which is, of course, Yuliya has mentioned. It takes some people. And what I'm specifically very much afraid of is that Ukraine, although we all hope that it will have a victory on the battlefield, it could be at some point a Pyrrhic victory, in a sense that there's a real prospect of facing a lost generation of citizenry. Also because the Russian Federation deprives Ukraine of its future, and Yuliya mentioned that situation with children. So this is just one of the multiple examples of how it's being done. So one sentence to sum up it. Certainly Ukraine needs soldiers to win a war, but it also needs hands and minds to rebuild, transform itself into the future. And we must look, because at least, I think rough estimates are that at least 12 million people had to leave their homes, are either internally displaced or those who simply had to reside in different countries. And it's a big question mark. And as progressives, I think it's very important to have that strong focus in mind. The other sort of quick thing that I would like to, I think, mention is also dealing with the question of securitization of public space and militarization of democracy. So I think there's rather agreement among many who participate in supporting Ukraine that it's almost as inevitability of militarization of Ukraine to secure its future. But what I would like to bring another point and to think about it is that Ukraine, and I will quote modern Ukrainian philosopher Volodymyr Yermolenko says that Ukraine is a world champion in survival, but it's also a country that is born in trauma and violence. And you see that it perpetuates even more. And Ukraine as a nation never had this time, nor skills, nor tools. It was never given, mostly by the Russia or any of its predecessors, time to process this deep trauma. And now, with all the atrocities and brutal onslaught that is going on, it will take possibly generations, decades to process that. And you need to start doing it now, because also of the long ramifications of such sort of process that is undertaking. So on that societal level. And last but not least, maybe one also detail that I'd like to emphasize that I think is very important. And again, many speakers mention it. That a lot of, or primarily, women, children travel outside or had to flee because men have to remain. So I think the sort of called the gender perspective or the gender attuned policies are no longer sort of a progressive wish list or something of a progressive aim. I think it's already a necessity to take that into deep and have it deeply ingrained in everything that the EU and international partners are doing when it comes to Ukraine. Also, again, because of the situation of the children and families that travel abroad, that stay abroad, that basically form Ukraine's future now, will participate in its recovery moving on. So I will just end on this. So again, this is just a few points that I think it's quite crucial to keep in mind while we're discussing all the type of the assistance that Ukraine should continue to receive from the international partners.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, André. I think these were really obviously thoughts and elements we have not touched on yet, and which normally in conflicts perhaps are not so focused on. I mean, making the difference between territory and people, and then also alluding to Ukraine history, that it never had time to more systematically deal with its traumas, is certainly something that should be taken into consideration when one thinks about reconstruction and how reconstruction can be designed. Thank you very much for these additional elements for the debate. Next one I have here is Ireneusz Bil joining us from Warsaw. Ireneusz, could you please introduce yourself briefly and then come in with your comment or question?
Yes, thank you very much, Uwe. Frankly speaking, I'm not calling you from Warsaw. I'm from Lithuania in Vilnius. So I will spend the first anniversary in Vilnius, also participating in a debate on the consequences of the war. My name is Ireneusz Bil. I'm heading the foundation of the former president of Poland, Aleksander Kwaśniewski. I am also a member of the FEPS scientific board, and I was also very glad to be invited to participate, to write an essay to the book that Uwe was mentioning. But I'd like today to comment more on that, what was said. So thank you very much for the inspiring contributions and very much complementary to each other by Yuliya, Stephen, and André. But I'd like to reflect in my few words, a few comments to that what was mentioned by László Andor in the beginning, because he said that hopefully when the peace will be achieved, EU will offer to Ukraine not only reconstruction but also transformation. And I'd like to refer here in two aspects. First, about this reconstruction and transformation. This is extremely important. Yuliya spoke about this. That I think nobody in Ukraine wants to get back to that what was before the war. Because as we know, Ukraine was struggling with a lot of internal challenges. It also from a, let's say, social democratic point of view, it had one of the highest, if not the highest, levels of inequalities, social and economic inequalities in Ukraine. The society was very much, if we can use the buzzword, very much liberal. The level of public support, of social contributions was also one of the lowest in the world. And it was not that Ukraine was a very poor country. No, it was more, let's say, a structural institutional approach to governance. And I think when now Ukrainians are coming to Europe as refugees, we know that there were over 7 to 8 million Ukrainians came to Europe. They also benefited from the social Europe. They have been, they have received financial contributions, legal contributions. They have become, when they are refugees, part of our societies. And I think they cherish very much this experience when they come back to Ukraine, hopefully soon. So that's first point. Second point is also about that what Yuliya mentioned, and also just André, about the value of people. Because the people are the most valuable resource of Ukraine. So therefore, I'm very much concerned to create conditions that Ukrainians, in the end, come back to Ukraine. Just a couple of days ago, a survey was published by the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees in Germany, when the Ukrainians said that only 34% of Ukrainians want to go back to Ukraine shortly after war is finished. And it's we have only 1 year behind us. So we can expect that if the war will last for another half year or even longer, this number will still be even smaller. So I think one of the most important tasks, not only for Ukraine, but also for EU, is to encourage the Ukrainians to go back and participate in the reconstruction of their country, to use the know-how, to use the knowledge they have gained, hopefully in Europe, to the benefit of Europe. So that's extremely important. Second is also about the political will to change. Also, we have now one anniversary of the war. So the Ukrainian rating group has carried out a poll in Ukraine about the support to EU membership and NATO membership in Ukraine. And really the outcome is staggering, because 87% of Ukrainians are today in favor of joining the EU, and 86% are in favor of joining NATO. Compared, for example, to 2014, 43% of Ukrainians were against NATO, and 34% were just in favor. So we can see that we have a huge political transformation, and the transformation of conscience of Ukrainians, that they know that the only way for them to survive and to develop, to change their country, to transform, is within the European Union and within NATO. So I think it's a good reflection point to that what Andrew Wilson once wrote 15 years ago, a book about the Ukrainians as an unexpected nation. Today, I think Ukrainians are not more unexpected. They know who they are, and they know where they want to go, and they know where they belong. So it's an extremely important change that has happened in Ukraine. And the last point to that, what Stephen said, because Stephen, you said that it's hard to imagine keeping the level of financial support to Ukraine. I fully agree to that. We know the political challenges that the Democrats are facing in the United States. Also, I can imagine that there will be time in the European Union where our societies will also put into question the level of finances that we and for military and non-military assistance that we are providing to Ukraine. And therefore, I think that a political will to end this war as soon as possible. And this is also about now the point about peace, because the word of peace was a couple of times used, that the peace is a precondition to offer Ukraine reconstruction and transformation. Knowing from the history of the, let's say, post-Soviet Union developments, it is hard to believe that peace would be attained very soon. In all the conflicts that either Soviet Union or Russia has been carrying out, there was never a peace treaty signed, be it with Georgia, be it with Moldova and Transnistria. Maybe in Chechnya, after the first invasion, Putin signed something which could be described an internal peace, but of course only to be broken a couple of years later when Putin decided to invade again Chechnya in 1999. Also, when you look on these big conflicts where all these superpowers were engaged, like for example in Korea, but also after Second World War, after the Potsdam Treaties, in fact, we had no peace treaties that would solve all the issues, that would reconcile the nations fighting, and that would bridge the difficulties to opening a new path. So I think, of course, we should strive for peace, but we should be also ready to that simply this conflict will be frozen at some point. I don't know where the border will be. Maybe the border will be where it is now, or maybe only Crimea, or I don't know. But I think we should be ready also to offer Ukraine a vision for security, for stability, and for development, even with there's no war, but freezing of the conflict. Because we know that freezing is something that Russia would be very happy with. This is all the lessons that we draw from the conflicts of the last 20 or 30 years. So finally, I think this is what we should have and keep in mind. Help Ukraine as much as we can today, because the negative externalities of Ukraine losing, like it was with the Spanish conflict, are simple to make a challenge for Europe to be incorporated, to be internalized. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ireneusz, for adding another group of important ideas that will have to be taken into consideration. I think to some extent the war has brought up developments which are precisely the opposite of what Vladimir Putin's objectives were. I mean, what you cited in regard to the polls on NATO membership and EU membership, it's much higher today than it was before the Russian intervention. I mean, we have a similar case with the NATO enlargement by Sweden and Finland, which for many years was something Russia wanted to impede at any costs almost. And now they're confronted with exactly the opposite of what they have strived for a while. I think I have now two more people on the list who want to speak. And after that, I would give back the floor to the three keynote speakers to comment on one or the other interventions we have heard from the round table. The next one on my list would be Angela Romano, and then it's Dasa Silovic. But Angela, you're first. Please also introduce yourself briefly and come on into the debate.
Thank you, Uwe. So I'm André Romano. I'm a historian of international relations and the Cold War in Europe specifically. And I'm moved from the University of Glasgow to the University of Bologna recently. And I am also the representative for the Fondazione Gramsci in the FEPS, and was involved in the previous projects of ours about the EU relations with Russia. when the war broke out. I wanted to jump in to and go back to the question of the EU and how Russia, Putin and his entourage have completely obliterated the EU from the picture. And my impression is that that is kind of a badge of honor for the EU. I wouldn't be very concerned. Also in the 70s and 80s, when the European communities raised very much its head vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, there was a determined position by the Kremlin not only to continue the non-recognition policy, but to downplay what had become clearly a political actor in the continent. And this was because the attraction that the community was exerting on the allies of the Soviet Union was growing very, very much, first economically, and then also as a possible partner in another sense, not in terms of joining in, that's too early. So to me, the fact that Putin is not mentioning the EU anymore is a confirmation of the fact, because it's not needed. It's not a great strategy. And I guess what we just said, the self-fulfilling prophecies are, the best testament of it, because it was very short-sighted not to see what this aggression would bring in terms of NATO expansion and so on, and supporting Ukraine for both organizations in the continent, but it's not immediate. So I think he is aware that the EU is now the goal for many Ukrainians. I think he is aware that the EU must have a say in the peace talk eventually, and that the Ukraine government would like to have that on board as much as the US. So this is the only weapon that the Kremlin has always used. And there are two main reasons for that. First, as you said, Russia only exists, or the Soviet Union, if it is a great power. That's their existential state of mind. And it's not just Putin, it is very widespread in the elite that can come to power or are in power. So there are few ones who think differently. So they only are keen to discuss with the United States, because discussing with anyone else would basically bring either somebody else in the elite of the superpowers that they do not want. So it's very intriguing to see how they behave with China, or downplay the importance, the weight of Russia itself. And so recognizing the EU in the law means that Russia is not as big as it wants to be anymore. And the second one is the specific neighborhood that it is contested between the European communities and now the Union and Russia. And this was a burning contention that we lost control over a while ago, also because we gave too much space to the United States to design the affairs in our neighborhood. So the European Union, even the emphasis on the language, Europe, is the immediate contestant on that space. And it's Ukraine today, it's Belarus after that, it's Georgia at the same time, Moldova. So all the spaces in the continent where Russia would have wanted to maintain a spatial influence, if not a direct control. So I think we shouldn't be concerned. We're there, we're massive. The Ukrainians will see us on board with the peace talk. So will the United States, unless we have another round of idiocy, like a Trump, edition of Trump or whoever for him. So, they're not going to be able to say no to a seat for the European Union in the peace talk. And I think what is needed, but I would like to hear very much your reactions on this, is probably for us in the European Union to stop thinking that we are not big enough and act like we are big enough. Now, a little bit more French attitude, punch above the weight, as they always used to do. We do have more weight, though, the French. So probably a change of our mind attitude in the European Union, which has also occurred already, would contribute to convince the Kremlin of adopting a different attitude and being more forthcoming and probably more reasonable on many points that we do care about.
Okay, Angela, thank you very much. Taking up an argument which already André Gerrits has introduced, the meaning of the EU for Putin and for Russia. Perhaps, as you say, if Russia would accept the EU on an equal footing, it means to the Russian elite that they wouldn't be as great as they want to be. That's probably why Putin was on so bad terms with Barack Obama, who said that once, it's nothing but a medium-sized power or something like that, which was probably one of the biggest offenses Putin could be confronted with. And certainly, if we look at things, how they develop, it is absolutely clear that the European Union institutionally will play a key role, if not the key role, in reconstruction. So thank you for this contribution. I have but one more person now to comment, and then I would like to give it back to André, to Yuliya, and to Stephen, but it's Dasa Silovic. Please come in.
Thank you very much, Uwe. I'm the chair of the Central Eastern European Gender Network, and I think a lot of the things that have been said are ringing so many bells. And thanks to you and thanks to László for inviting me. I wasn't thinking of speaking, but I have to subscribe with a lot that was said. And thank you very much for a very insightful perspective. Now, Yuliya was doing a great job in trying to figure out what's going to happen next in terms of inequalities. She mentioned also the gender equality, the traffickings, and so on, all that we have confronted back in 1999, in the 1990s, coming both from the Balkans, but also, Yuliya, I must say, we had a big problem with women from Ukraine, and a lot of the corruption coming from Ukraine in those years that we had to take care of, especially with either trafficking with women or sometimes children, but basically it was women. So we've gone through a process, and it's very interesting that we call this as the first big after Second World War conflict, which was the same thing said about the conflict in the Balkans back in the 90s. So somehow we can both commensurate, and we can at the same time provide a certain number of lessons, which we intend to do very soon with our partners, including FEPS and others. I would subscribe with the speakers. Stephen was talking about the big geopolitical picture. Yes, when you come to take in the big geopolitical picture, what happened to the Balkans, we were not in the picture. The 90s were preoccupied with the I would say reform, reconstruction, redressing of the Soviet Union, and the Balkans were not that much in the limelight at this point. Well, this is a conflict we can contain. The question for us now is: do we contain the conflict? Do we freeze the conflict, as André has said, I think, or do we try to negotiate? And I think Stephen spoke about it. I haven't seen anything today about the Chinese proposal, whatever it is, it's going to be. But I'll come to that then. Yuliya was very, very correct in speaking about inequalities. I haven't heard the word of corruption. What we have experienced in the Balkans, and that's why I'm not going to relate myself to that, is a process of negotiations which has not stopped the political, economic, and social order that was there in the making in the beginning of the 90s. Actually, what has happened, that I would call it now neoliberal order, has only been exacerbated. The freezing, or at least the semi-solution of the conflict, is still there. Borders are not yet set in within many countries. Every time nationalism or borders or anything is in political interest of the ruling elites or whoever is used, issues like North Macedonia have taken a very long time to resolve, and they're not fully resolved at this point. And we are in a limbo, in a way, in two sectors. One sector is that political solution, which goes up and down, and a lot of us have been quite concerned of how the Ukraine conflict is going to affect, and is affecting still, relationships within Bosnia and Herzegovina after a Dayton agreement, which basically has frozen the conflict. A Dayton agreement that has gone into and I would say unsocial democratic, undemocratic, citizen democratic mode, in the sense of freezing it on national lines. We still have not come over the national lines, and those national lines are still hanging in there between the Muslims, the Croats and Croatia, the Serbs and Serbia, etc., etc. So there's a huge lesson on negotiations, and I certainly agree on the need to, especially for the progressive community, for the European progressive and social democratic community, to actually try to get into that peace process discussion. Now, something about reconstruction, and I fully agree what Yuliya has said with the sufferings, with the destruction, etc., etc. But that infrastructure destruction, and I've actually spoken, I've seen what quite a few countries and governments are now looking at, cannot go. And I think that should be the sine qua non of a political and democratic transformation, which means that that on our side, and now I'm coming back to the progressive family, I would say European progressive family, and I would say the European perspective, because it's not the same as the US perspective. And I think Stephen rightly pointed out the priorities, and at the same time, the systems. If we are so keen on accession, if we are so keen on opening up the doors, etc., etc., that demands those political reforms. And in that sense, the progressive family within the European Union actually should be strongly involved, because many of you know that we have pretty struggled, and my network has worked in Ukraine. We pretty struggled to find those kernels, those civil society organizations that were going to bear the flag and the concept and the politics of progressive, socialist, social democratic, whatever, even liberal perspectives. We are, my network is very much attuned to a number of colleagues working in Ukraine at this point, and looking at these political trends.
Mind a little bit of time, please.
Yeah. I am over, and I would like just to stress that there is no, of course, alternative to assisting Ukraine, but there is an alternative to assisting Ukraine in a more, I would say, strategic and I would say democratic perspective. Over to you. Over to you, Uwe. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dasa, I think that's precisely one of the things we wanted to do in this debate. You referred to lessons learned from the last big conflict we had in Europe, which also the form it took was unexpected. The brutality it took was unexpected, and it's still not solved in many respects, as you have outlined. So I think one of the things when we come to a post-war state, whatever it is in Ukraine, these lessons learned from the Balkans could be an important factor in setting up a successful reconstruction strategy. Now, looking at my watch, we have still another half hour roughly, and I have two people who want to come into the debate, Bohdan Ferens and Giovanni Grevi. Bohdan, I think we take you on in this block, but Giovanni, I would ask you to wait a little, because the question you want to address, as I saw in the chat, we will take up in the end of the event once again. And so I would ask you to come in more towards the end of the event. Bohdan, are you connecting from Kiev?
Yes, good afternoon, dear friends, dear partners. Yes, I'm connecting from Kiev, sunny Kiev, by the way. I'm Bohdan Ferens, I'm founder of Social Democratic Platform. And also I was happy to just prepare some piece of paper in the context how the Russian war influenced on the internal political processes in Ukraine. But anyway, I just have just a few short remarks concerning the previous discussion. I think the first one is that Putin sees no influence in EU leaders. It's my personal perception. It means that he just, Putin, for example, 10 or 15 years ago and Putin now is quite different politician, I think, because he tried just somehow to work with the EU, I mean, with member states, with France, with Germany, with others. But now he totally believes that main players in the EU are dependent on the position of the US in security and in other contexts. That's why I don't feel such a possibility now for some kind of intervene from the position of EU leader, I mean, from the position of Scholz or Macron, for example, to influence somehow on the negotiation processes. And we had a clear picture when, before the full-scale invasion, the diplomacy collapsed. The second remark is concerning the willingness to negotiate. It is also an internally very sensitive issue now in Ukraine, because on the one hand, everyone wants the war to end, except Russia, I think, Putin and Kremlin. But it is, you know, the question is, but is there any adequacy in the perception of what is happening in the Kremlin, you know, on the ground? I'm not sure that they just have this adequate understanding of vision in the context of possible future negotiations. And also internally in Ukraine, thousands of Ukrainian families just lost their husbands, dads, relatives. And it means that any kind of peace negotiations will be totally very difficult and sensitive issue. And it will be, how to say, influenced by the political processes also. I tried just to analyze somehow how Ukrainian internal politics just has been changed for this 1 year. And I think that new circumstances radically altered domestic policy. This was especially evident in the first months of the war, and many internal processes were put on pause. Of course, we understand that when you firstly need to survive and to save your country, some other issues, political internal issues, are subordinated to this primarily main goal. But anyway, I see somehow some changes. I think some positive changes internally here in Ukraine. For example, the context of de-oligarchization. As you know, the war also significantly affected the Ukrainian oligarchs, and President Zelensky's commitment to de-oligarchization not only survived, but also intensified under the pressure of new circumstances. And the ongoing war and the imposition of martial law have provided the government with an opportunity to significantly limit the influence of the oligarchs, but let's see in what ways this will be conducted. Anyway, I will be happy when the book will be published, and I think it will be quite useful to read. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. And taking this opportunity, I would like to invite all of you to our event on Saturday, 25th, also 1 year of anniversary. I will share a link to László and to other colleagues from FEPS. They can share these links too, and we'll be happy to join communication in supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you, Bohdan. Quite interesting. I think your reflections on how serious does Putin take European leaders and how does he interpret their independence, if there is any at all in his perception. But what I also want to take up from what you've said is that it might well be that the Kremlin itself doesn't know what's happening precisely on the battlefield. Yeah, we will see this. Now, the changes in domestic politics, which you indicate coming through the war, may give some hope then for a post-war period, because if it really contributes to something like a de-oligarchization of your state and society, it might be a better start than in the first transition. So we'll see. Thank you for your input. With this, I would close the round here and would come back to the three keynote speakers of the beginning of the event. And I would like to ask you if you want to comment on some of the things we've heard from the roundtable. I mean, I think it's up to you. Of course, nobody expects that you take up all the aspects that were raised, but I see already, Yuliya and Stephen, that you have things you would like to comment on. So, Yuliya, do you want to start again?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much. Very interesting and informed discussion. It's really thought-stimulating and indeed extremely important issues that are being raised. I'm going to work in a bit of a reverse order. I agree with Bohdan about this kind of the way that the Kremlin sees the EU, and indeed Putin and his regime have spent years trying to undermine any kind of consolidated position that would be, especially on Ukraine, but not only in the EU. They've been funding the far-right parties in making some really unholy alliances. And I think it is specifically this kind of discordance that he has been banking on. But indeed, when we look at specifically geopolitical dimension and the military dimension, he sees the EU individual member states at the very least as being more of an orbit of the United States than anything else. Economically speaking, it's a separate matter, and we need to have a separate conversation about that. I want to say that I'm a little bit less optimistic about the oligarchization in Ukraine. Some of the enterprises that have been taken under state control, like, and if you look at the small print, more of it is sort of temporary than anything else. But I would really like to see a serious de-oligarchization effort, and that would require not just taking temporary control of certain enterprises, but transforming the whole economic system, where oligarchs are simply not possible to be. A number of enterprises, including the energy distribution enterprises like DTEK of Akhmetov, has been privatized against the current at the time privatization laws. Those enterprises had no business being privatized in the first place. So de-oligarchization would mean massive renationalization and repossession of assets of oligarchs. That, to me, will mean a meaningful de-oligarchization program and not anything else, because the rest of it is just ends up being nominal whitewash. Dasa, I agree completely with what you were saying, if you don't mind me going to your first name. I'm well aware of the trafficking that has been happening in the 90s in Ukraine. I was asked to comment specifically on the years of war, but in the chapter I do speak to how the problems that have exploded, excuse me for the poor choice of word here, since the most recent invasion, the first and the most recent invasion, they have not been created by the war, they have been exacerbated by the war. There are certain that are unique, but most of them have been simply exacerbated. And that's why I also start by saying that Ukraine has been de-developed through the transitional market. I'm very critical about the corruption and embezzlement of state assets. Indeed, we have seen some horrendous scandals recently of embezzling money of state funds on purchases for the military, and that's just the top of the iceberg. And that only happened, the exposure of these scandals had and hunting for them has started happening in Ukraine when they started getting some serious signals of straightening themselves out from the EU and from the US. So that was destroyed through the last 30-odd years of Ukraine's nominal independence. That all needs to be fixed, and that will require a lot of very heavy work. And also, I agree with you completely, oversight and input from the EU. One of the reasons why people were joining the Maidan protest in 2014, and one of the reasons that people wanted Ukraine to, like average people wanted Ukraine to become part of the EU, is precisely because of that bureaucratic oversight, because they do not trust domestic politicians. They want the rule of law. They want the rule of law. And here I think this kind of the promise of EU membership, whenever that will happen and how, that is something that allows those who are willing to fight for a better country to actually have some sort of means and yardsticks according to which to measure this kind of performance in the country. And that will mean, again, like, you know, coming to the there were, I think it was Ireneusz who mentioned the.
Yuliya, may I?
I'm going to, yeah, one final
It's not about you. I mean, it's just a general comment. I mean, we are approaching the end, and as always in these meetings, you start losing people. So I would ask you, Yuliya, but also then Stephen and André, to just mind the time when you come in with your comments, so that we can close more or less in 15 to 20 minutes.
Yes. Thank you very much. Just one final point very quickly. We mentioned negative externalities that need to be targeted. One of the things that I mentioned in my chapter is that we need to be talking about positive externalities. This is something that needs to be integrated as part of returns on social investment. When we start rethinking, when we see differently how state spending can be assessed and its return on that spending can be assessed, then those budgetary constraints that have been advised by organizations such as International Monetary Fund, they can be resolved differently. We need to integrate social spending, environmental spending, spending in care, childcare, education. Without that, there will be no future for Ukraine or any other society. Deep sustainability, and that means social. That social aspect is so important. People need to be looked after, and then people who are looked after will build the rest. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your affirmativeness and for your optimism. I also think that actually, if you look at the transition processes in the early 90s, we're at a totally different stage now, because we know about transition. We know much more. And without what you are advocating now, there is no chance to have a successful transition in these times. We didn't know that in the 90s. That was a one-off laboratory event when we run into the transitions of whole Eastern Europe. So thank you very much for insisting here on a certain type of reconstruction. Now, I would like to come to Steve Bronner, but Steve, before you take the word, if Giovanni Grevi is still there, he promised a short intervention on negotiations, and maybe you could take this up into your comment. Is Giovanni still around? Does he want to make his point? I'm asking our, yep. Yeah, Giovanni is no, yeah, he left. Okay, Stephen, then it's up to you. Come on in.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much. I mean, this was a really great discussion, very different from most I've had about Ukraine. In any event, I was going to talk about a peace plan that was developed and presented by my International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue in conjunction with the European Center for Democracy and Development and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and the National Platform for Reconciliation and Unity in Ukraine. But I've decided not to do so. I'm not going to lay that out. If for those of you who are interested, you can check it at the at OSCE, where it was presented in Warsaw in September of 2022. There you can see the whole plan we have. But I think some issues that were raised are so important that they should be addressed directly. Let me start with Ireneusz, if I'm saying this properly. You are quite right in much that you say about peace, but I think we have to recognize a few issues here. First, peace is not now on the agenda, I agree. But precisely for that reason, it's important to raise the need for it, and perhaps to also note some speculative preconditions for bringing it about. Now, the first, you mentioned peace being temporary. Peace is always temporary, and it's not reducible to treaties. Treaties come after the peace is already more or less de facto in place. And it seems to me that it's quite true what Dasa says. The choice is to either contain, freeze, or flee the conflict. Let me emphasize the freeze, because that's what Ireneusz mentioned. And he talked about a stalemate coming about. It's very possible that that's true. But this, I think, would not be a very beneficial situation for anyone. This is sort of what it reminds me of Trotsky's neither war nor peace in the Russian Revolution. A stalemate, though, I think would drain both Ukraine and Russia, and it would destabilize. Destabilize the entire region potentially. It seems to me also that the longer the stalemate takes place, the more this will cost. We're already talking about, as Yuliya said, $1 trillion roughly in reconstruction. Imagine, well, a year or two of stalemate, and how much that will add to the cost. Plus, it's going to, I think, increase the calls for, if you like, suspending participation in the conflict. This is going to create tremendous frustration, in my view. And it also seems to me that it will increase the number of refugees, increase the the worst aspects for what will happen with reconstruction later. The final point I want to make, though, is with regard to Putin's inability to see what's going on the ground. That's probably true, but it's also true, I think, in the West. The media in the United States, if I can say so, even the progressive media, has been completely irresponsible in the way it's presented the war. This has been a celebratory depiction, which goes across the board. MSNBC, CNN, some of this you'll see the New York Times, all the progressive media. We are being presented with an image of the war without the constraints and the obstacles to finishing it. The idea that, as I suggested, that one side will win in the traditional sense of the term seems to me a mistake, but that's precisely what's being presented. And it's up to the progressive community to provide a meaningful critique with positive purposes and aims.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, especially for mentioning the role of the media in this whole affair, which I would say also from my personal experience in Germany is highly problematic. It really doesn't cover realities, but basically wishful thinking.
Exactly.
And if we consider that in a globalized world, the conflicts are very often about narratives and about which narrative dominates and sets the standards, this is worrying, what you mentioned. And I would share your view. That's certainly an aspect we also have to take into consideration seriously. All right, last but not least, André, you have the last word, so to speak. What are the aspects you want to take on from the debate?
Well, a few words on EU and Russia and the future of EU-Russia relations. Angela called it a badge of honor. That's one way of putting it, but that doesn't make the challenge for the European Union any less pressing. It's partially old news, obviously. The EU has always been more interested in Russia than Russia has been in the European Union. And Bohdan is right. For Putin and for the Russian Federation, the grand other still remains more so than ever the United States. But my point here is relations between the EU and Russia have changed qualitatively in the course of the last year, particularly in terms of mutual dependencies, energy relations, etc. That must have can also have an enormous impact on how the EU on the EU strategy towards Russia. I mean, look at the situation of Germany, for example. So it's new and old challenges, which forces us to think that through more thoroughly. Final word on it's a pity that Giovanni has left us on peace deals and stuff. I think Ireneusz is absolutely right, and I've had that idea from the very beginning. This war is not going to end in a formalized peace deal. This war is going to end because this war is going to end at a certain moment. And I think that even goes for most wars. They simply stop, they simply end. Can this war be a frozen one in the end? I think the comparison between the war in Ukraine and the so-called frozen conflicts elsewhere in the former Soviet Union has its shortcomings. And the major shortcoming, of course, is the power of the Ukrainian armed forces, which is very, very different from Russia's opponents in all those other conflicts that have now become frozen. My point here, the most important point, I think, which I want to make in this context is that we should not necessarily focus all the time on the formalities of a peace deal. Right. It's much too painful, it's much too controversial, it's much too sensitive, as Bohdan rightly emphasized. We should use, let's say, sort of a broader framework and that is how to end this war without a formal peace deal, without a formal peace agreement. And that requires a sort of to reset our mind, our frame of mind a bit concerning how we can contribute to the ending of this war. This requires much more thinking and stuff, but still, my comments. Thank you, Uwe.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we've come to an end with this. I mean, the question is coming up what comes up after survival of Ukraine, and how does it look like? From what we've seen up to now, I think what's really tragic is that we have basically seen escalation. And we have seen political escalation, military escalation, economic escalation, and too little systematic attempts of mediation to come to whatever kind of negotiation. Okay. I would like to thank you all for your engaged inputs and debate. I think it's always difficult in a format like this, where we cannot see each other and we do not meet physically to discuss issues like this. But I felt it was an open talk, which was what we wished for in FEPS. And I think what was brought up as arguments were all elements that can feed into a constructive approach to a post-war situation in Ukraine. I think what's particularly clear is that we can only interpret a war, this war and a conflict like this today on a global level. There are no longer wars of big powers without global repercussions. And what do we know what these famous Chinese proposal might have to be seriously discussed? We'll see. So I think one constant of this war and conflict is the unforeseen. We are confronted with many unforeseen developments. And that goes for the West as well as for Russia and Putin. I think that's very clear. It is an unexpected aggression and war with largely unforeseen, enormous repercussions everywhere. And the people of Ukraine are suffering the worst part of all that. So I thank you again. I hope you stay connected to FEPS and to our work. You will find open doors if you approach us. László and myself, I think I may say so, László, we hope that the book is an impetus to a better informed debate on the conflict. And I think we should all hope that we meet soon in a more peaceful global situation. Thank you very much. And that was it for today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care to all of them. Thank you.